introduce Simon Dickinson, the guy who wrote the subject guide. So let me watch. Hang on.
Today we're going to introduce the topic of globalization. Globalization is a topic that all students have to do, and sometimes they find going to introduce the topic of globalization. My name is Rosie Gosling, I'm Director of External Study at London School of Economics, and today we're going to introduce the topic of globalization. Globalization is a topic that all students have to do, and sometimes they find it quite difficult. Therefore, we thought today it would be useful for you to meet Simon Dickinson, who wrote the chapter on globalization for the new subject guide. Simon Dickinson works at the LSE. This is Simon Dickinson, and today we're going to talk to him about how to approach this particular chapter. Sometimes students find difficult. So, Simon, the process of globalization is all around us. Why are you so interested in globalization?
Well, as a sociologist, I think globalization really impinges on all of our concerns. Okay? All of the traditional topics that the sociologists are interested in: religion, crime, family, inequality, politics, and so on. And if you look at sociologists at LSE, they're very much concerned with globalization, increasing global interdependence between people and firms and other organizations. They're interested in migration, they're interested in global cities, they're interested in organized crime, and so on. And my research deals with globalization insofar as it affects how NGOs run their campaigns, that's non-governmental organizations, and firms and how they deal with global problems like conservation and working conditions in supply chains.
And you work very closely with Nigel Dodd, who also suggested in the first video we had that actually you have to take into consideration not simple societies, but the global society, because we cannot understand individual behaviour without understanding global behaviour. Is that what you would suggest?
Absolutely. We need to look at processes that span borders, that cross different countries. Okay, so we might look at how goods and services are produced, not just in one location in one country, but across many locations in many regions and cities around the world.
And do you think it's inevitable? Do you think it's going to continue in this way? Or do you think there might be some changes in this way?
Well, globalization is a very complex process, one that's, that some people describe as irreversible, inevitable, and as something that really we just have to get used to. But others take a longer view and say, look, the world has been globalized, internationalized for long periods in its history, and that it's also reversible, that states can limit the extent to which globalization occurs.
Good. And one of the things that you learnt in chapter 4 is you learnt the importance of theory and the way that theory developed in sociology over time, as it moved from the Enlightenment to questions about postmodernity, etc. So we're trying to explain these processes, and in any answer you write, you'll need to refer always to chapter 4 in the subject guide. Now, just to reinforce, these videos are to encourage you to begin reading. We don't expect you at this point to know very much about it. These are just introductory areas. Now, often in the literature, you talk about, and people talk about globalization as if it was an individual. People like, globalization is responsible for all our ills. Globalization seems to stalk the world, actively doing things. It's, globalization is a person. It's not a person, it's a process, but how can we connect these two? Globalization isn't a person, globalization is a process. How should students deal with this sort of idea, or this particular metaphor?
Well, students begin by looking at the world around them and asking, well, how the food that they're eating, how the clothes they're wearing, how the decisions their politicians make, how did they arrive at these things? What series of events led to the goods and services that are available to them? Okay, so we might look at where the goods are produced, Okay, where you might be sitting at your dinner table in, let's say, Italy, and in the knowledge that some of the agricultural produce that went into that meal was originated in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa. The films you're watching might come from the film industry in Mumbai, in India, or they might originate from Hollywood, and so on. So if you think about the concrete steps, the concrete series of events that gave rise to all the things in the world around you, not just material things, but ideas too.
So this is a process rather than globalisation as an individual. One of our colleagues, Leslie Sclair, writes about that's exactly what you talked about now. We're eating snow peas that come from Mexico. We're eating, having roses that come from Kenya. Do you think there's a problem about transporting all these goods and services, well, goods particularly, from one place to another?
Well, it poses a real technological challenge for a start. That might point us to look at the kind of technological changes that have occurred in transportation, communications, the dependence of these processes on satellite communications and so on. Okay, so it's an organizational feat. Okay, but there are also more conventional problems we might think of in terms of the environmental impact of transporting goods over large distances, and the kinds of emissions, the kind of pollution that might cause, or use of energy that might demand to transport by plane and so on, all these goods across borders, and the impact that has on climate change, for example, which is a major environmental and global problem that we face.
So sociologists are looking at both aspects, whether globalisation can give us the goods and services which we could never have had before, and the communication that we could never have before, but it also carries with us costs. And in this chapter, you introduced us to the idea of some of these costs, which is very, very important. One of those things that students find extremely difficult, and we ask them about this, is whether it's globalisation or it's internationalisation. What's the difference, Simon?
Well, internationalisation really assumes that the exchanges that are going on across the globe are really being conducted by people, firms, organisations, political actors that have a national base. Okay, so we're talking about globalisation, they might say, is really increased contact between, let's say, the Chinese government and the US government. Okay, increased diplomacy or contact there. Or it might be increased trade between the two countries, okay, and increased cultural contact between the two countries, consumption of Hollywood movies and so on. People who describe this process in terms of globalization, okay, suggest that actually we're not talking about exchanges anymore just between nationally based actors, but that companies increasingly have no national basis, have no home country. They are truly global in the sense that research and development might take place in one country, their headquarters might be in another, production facilities might be in yet another part of the globe. So to say that they are in one way or another connected or associated or have a natural home in one country is false. And the same might go for cultural entities too, like subcultures. Okay, so you might talk about, let's say, musical styles, okay, or rap or hip hop and so on. So, to what extent does it make sense to say that that is an American phenomenon? Now that you can find rap artists or musicians all over the world.
Do you like that?
I can't say I'm not familiar with it, but
it's a phenomenon we look at. So just to reinforce, the idea of internationalism is bipartisanism, is the relationship between nation-states. We'll be looking at nation-states in the next video. But in this case, we're looking at trans relationships, so transnational linkages, not international linkages. Thank you very much, that's very useful. Students quite often find that difficult. And it's particularly important when we look at what David Held calls the skeptics, because the skeptics do agree it's international, whereas people like Leslie Sklair talks about transnational, and people who believe that globalisation has occurred talk about transnational rather than international relationships.